Welcome to today's Explainer. Have you ever just felt like, I don't know, your brain is running on a low battery? Or maybe like you're functioning with way too many tabs open at once? Well, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're exploring this really profound concept. The idea that the human mind actually operates a whole lot like a digital computer. And here's the secret. By understanding our underlying mental processes, our internal operating system, if you will, we absolutely gain the power to hack our own habits, optimize our learning, and literally rewire how we experience the world around us.
Okay, let's dive into this. It's kind of provocative, isn't it? Are you a human, or are you just a highly advanced computer? For decades now, cognitive psychologists have used the metaphor of the computer to map out exactly how we think, learn, remember, and solve complex problems. Today, we're going to look at how this one single metaphor absolutely revolutionized psychology, how it explains our most frustrating mental glitches, and most importantly, how you can actually use this framework to update your own mental software.
So, here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, opening the black box. Second, the computer mind. Third, glitches and system errors. Fourth, debugging your brain. And finally, number 5, beyond the machine.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Opening the Black Box. To really grasp how we view the mind today, we actually have to travel back to the early 20th century. Back then, scientists basically treated the mind as a locked black box. Behaviorism absolutely ruled the day. Behaviorists like B.F. Skinner argued that we should only study observable actions. They looked strictly at a stimulus and a response. To them, internal thoughts just couldn't be objectively measured, so they simply ignored them. But eventually, this satisfaction started to grow. Scientists realized, wait a minute, you can't have a complete understanding of behavior without looking at what actually happens between the stimulus and the response. And this brilliantly illustrates the birth of cognitive psychology, a field that finally dared to study the software, those internal mediational processes like memory, perception, and attention.
Now, this massive shift was powered by the idea of the hypothetical construct. See, behavior has previously only allowed for these really strict intervening variables that were tied to physical inputs and outputs. But cognitive psychologists realized that to generate real, meaningful explanations, they needed theories with what they called surplus meaning. By comparing the mind to a computer, scientists could get creative. They could theorize about hidden cognitive states, like your memory acting as a hard drive, even if they couldn't literally see it under a microscope.
Moving right along to Section 2, the computer mind.
By the 1950s, computer technology provided this absolutely irresistible new metaphor for the brain. And things moved incredibly fast during this cognitive revolution. In 1956, George Miller established that our short-term memory acts a whole lot like a limited RAM drive, capable of holding about 7 chunks of information at a time. Then, in 1967, Ulrich Neisser literally wrote the book on cognitive psychology, officially establishing the field. And by 1968, Atkinson and Shiffrin proposed the multi-store memory model. They definitively structured human memory into sensory, short-term, and long-term storage. It's exactly like a digital filing system.
So, the crucial point is how this all flows together in what's known as information processing theory. Step 1 is input. We take in data through perception and filter it with our attention. Step 2 is storage and processing, holding it in memory, actively thinking about it, and modifying that info into a meaningful form. And step 3 is output, retrieving that stored knowledge to actually make a decision or drive a behavior. Basically, your mind is taking environmental data, running it through your internal software, and generating an output.
But what happens when things go wrong? That brings us to Section 3, glitches and system errors.
As we all know from staring at frozen screens, software isn't perfect, right? It makes weird errors. And the primary issue for us is that our mental system has really strict constraints. Our cognitive capacity is limited. A classic 1959 study by Peterson and Peterson showed that short-term memory decays incredibly rapidly if you aren't actively rehearsing the information. So to deal with this limited capacity, our attention operates as a bottleneck. This is known as Broadbent's filter model. We literally discard massive amounts of sensory data just to prevent our brains from crashing. This perfectly explains the famous cocktail party effect. You can completely filter out a loud, crowded room just to hear one specific conversation. Yet, your brain is subconsciously monitoring all that background noise, instantly grabbing your attention if someone all the way across the room happens to say your name.
Another way our brain saves processing power is by using schemas. You can think of these as prepackaged cognitive frameworks built from your past experiences. They help you interpret incoming data instantly so you aren't constantly overwhelmed. But they also cause some major system errors. Frederick Bartlett demonstrated this beautifully in his famous War of the Ghosts study. He found that when people recalled an unfamiliar folktale, they unconsciously distorted the story, reshaping their own memories to fit their pre-existing cultural expectations. We heavily distort reality just to make it fit the templates we already have installed.
Now, what's really interesting about this concept is just how fragile it makes our memory. Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer famously showed participants a video of a car crash. When they simply asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other, people estimated much higher speeds and even falsely remembered seeing broken glass, compared to when the word hit was used. Subtle wording literally rewrote their memories. Crazy, right? And then consider the Stroop effect. If you try naming the color of the ink when the written word spells out a different color, your automatic processing of reading completely interferes with your conscious effort to name the color. It is a pure attentional glitch.
Okay, so how do we fix this? Let's get into Section 4, debugging your brain. So our hardware is limited and our attention gets easily bottlenecked. But hey, now that we understand the glitches, we can actually apply the patches. Perhaps the single greatest practical application of cognitive psychology is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. You can honestly think of CBT as a literal software update for your mind. Conditions like anxiety and depression are often maintained by a vicious cycle of negative thinking loops, stuff like catastrophic thinking and selective attention only to threats. CBT teaches you to identify these distorted thought patterns, these literal glitches in your code, and actively challenge them with realistic, balanced beliefs. You are actively rewriting the code that governs your emotional outputs.
We also make some pretty terrible everyday decisions based on unconscious mental heuristics, those little shortcuts that lead to cognitive biases. Well, here's your cheat sheet to patch those everyday system errors. First, for confirmation bias, where you only ever see what you already believe, the patch is to actively seek out opposing viewpoints. Next, for the availability heuristic, where you judge risks based on vivid or dramatic memories, the patch is to stop, take a breath, and look up actual statistics. And finally, for the anchoring bias, where a first impression or an initial price completely skews your judgment, the patch is to purposefully delay your decision and gather multiple sources.
Oh, and we can also completely optimize how we process and store new information using some scientifically backed study techniques. So, don't cram. Use spaced repetition, spreading out your learning to lock it into long-term storage. Use retrieval practice. Actively test yourself instead of just mindlessly rereading the page. Try interleaving, which just means mixing up different topics in one single session to really sharpen your problem-solving skills. And use elaboration, explaining concepts in your own words to create deeper semantic encoding. Guys, these aren't just boring study chores, these are literal processing hacks for your brain.
Let's move on and see how this builds into our final section, Part 5, Beyond the Machine.
Now, as incredibly powerful as the computer metaphor is, we do eventually have to address its limitations. A standard computer is a rigid, serial processor. It operates logically, step by step. But human cognition, it isn't a cold, calculating hard drive. Our biological hardware is incredibly messy. We don't just process information based on syntax, we are heavily influenced by our physical states, our daily motivations, and our emotions. For instance, anxiety doesn't just sit in the background, it actively changes how we encode and retrieve our memories. We constantly use top-down processing, where our own expectations alter our very perception of reality.
And because of this, modern cognitive psychology has really evolved. We now understand the brain through the lens of parallel distributed processing, also known as connectionism. So instead of a simple linear sequence of inputs and outputs, our mind is actually a vast neural network that processes massive amounts of information simultaneously and highly adaptively. And here is the absolute incredible irony of modern science. Artificial intelligence is no longer the model for the human brain. Today, the most advanced AI in the world is actually desperately trying to mimic the simultaneous, adaptable, associative architecture of your brain.
The real truth is the human brain effortlessly grasps meaning and context. A computer can manipulate formal symbols, sure, but it doesn't inherently understand them. But you do. You use memory, inference, and complex schemas to instantly navigate a wildly unpredictable world. Your internal systems are these awe-inspiring, meaning-making machines that adapt, heal, and learn every single day.
So, we've moved from treating the mind as a locked black box to finally understanding the incredible networks that drive our every thought and action. You know the glitches now, and you have the patches. So, my final question to you is simply this. If you now have the tools to rewrite your own mental software, what will you program next? Thank you so much for exploring the mind with me on today's Explainer, and as always, keep learning.